The war room fell silent. It was the spring of 1945, and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat across from a group of captured German generals, men who had orchestrated some of the most brutal campaigns on the Eastern and Western fronts. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the architects of Blitzkrieg, the minds behind panzer divisions that had crushed nations in weeks. They had faced the Soviet hordes at Stalingrad, survived the meat grinder of Kursk, and commanded armies against the combined might of the Allied forces. Yet, as they spoke candidly in the quiet aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse, a pattern emerged that would fundamentally alter Eisenhower's understanding of psychological warfare. The German officers weren't discussing tactics or equipment superiority. They weren't analyzing logistical chains or strategic miscalculations. They were talking about fear. Specifically, they were talking about one man, General George S. Patton, Jr. When asked which Allied commander they feared most, the answer was unanimous and immediate. Not Bernard Montgomery, the methodical British field marshal who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein. Not Omar Bradley, the steady American commander known as the Soldiers' General. Not even Eisenhower himself, the supreme authority coordinating millions of men across multiple fronts. It was Patton, the profane, pearl-handled pistol-wearing cavalryman who led the Third Army like a force of nature. Eisenhower's reaction to this revelation was complex. On one level, it confirmed something he had long suspected about the nature of command and the psychological dimensions of warfare. On another, it exposed a profound irony at the heart of Allied strategy. Montgomery, whom Churchill had championed as Britain's greatest military mind, had been given priority in resources, planning, and public recognition. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious attempt to end the war by Christmas 1944, had consumed vast quantities of men and material, only to fail catastrophically at Arnhem. Meanwhile, Patton, often restrained by Eisenhower's own orders, had been racing across France with a fraction of the supplies, liberating territory at a pace that shocked both allies and enemies alike. But why did the Germans fear Patton more than Montgomery? The answer lay not in conventional military metrics, but in something far more primal and psychologically destabilizing. Patton was chaos incarnate. He moved with a speed that defied military orthodoxy, exploiting breakthroughs before German commanders even realized they existed. His Third Army covered distances in days that should have taken weeks. He operated on instinct and aggression, pushing his men to the edge of human endurance and beyond. Where Montgomery would halt to consolidate gains and ensure supply lines were secure, Patton would charge forward on fumes and ammunition scrounged from captured depots. He understood something fundamental about warfare that transcends textbook strategy. Momentum is a weapon, and the psychological impact of relentless, unpredictable aggression can shatter enemy cohesion faster than any artillery barrage. The German generals described facing Patton's forces with a visceral dread that went beyond tactical concern. They spoke of the terror that rippled through Wehrmacht ranks when intelligence reports indicated the Third Army was in their sector. Patton didn't just defeat German units, he annihilated them with such speed and ferocity that survivors carried stories that demoralized entire divisions. His reputation became a weapon in itself, a psychological force multiplier that made German commanders second-guess their own decisions. Where was Patton now? What was his next objective? How could they stop a commander who seemed to operate outside the normal constraints of logistics and caution? Eisenhower absorbed this information with the calculating mind of a supreme strategist. He had spent the entire war balancing political pressures from Washington and London, managing the massive egos of commanders like Montgomery and Patton, and coordinating a coalition that was always one disagreement away from fracture. He had restrained Patton repeatedly, sometimes for legitimate operational reasons, sometimes to appease Montgomery and the British command structure, sometimes because Patton's aggressive impulses threatened to outrun his supply lines and expose his flanks to counterattack. But hearing these German generals speak so candidly about their fears, Eisenhower confronted an uncomfortable truth. In the brutal calculus of total war, fear might be more valuable than precision. This realization didn't come as a sudden epiphany. Eisenhower was too experienced, too politically astute to make simplistic judgments about military effectiveness. He understood that Montgomery's caution and value, that Bradley's steadiness provided essential stability, and that his own role required diplomatic finesse as much as strategic vision. But the German testimony planted a seed of doubt that would shape his post-war reflections. Had the Allies, in their effort to maintain coalition unity and follow established military doctrine, inadvertently constrained their most psychologically effective weapon?
Had the fear of Patton's unpredictability and potential for controversy caused them to win the war more slowly and at greater cost than necessary?
To understand why German generals feared Patton above all others, one must first understand the Wehrmacht's institutional psychology in the final years of the war. By 1944, the German military machine, once considered the most formidable fighting force on earth, was a wounded beast, still dangerous but increasingly desperate. These were men who had witnessed the disintegration of the Eastern Front, where entire army groups had been swallowed by Soviet offensives. They had seen the Luftwaffe reduced to irrelevance, their cities turned to ash by Allied bombing campaigns, and their once invincible panzer divisions reduced to fighting defensive battles with dwindling fuel and ammunition. Yet even in this state of strategic collapse, German officers maintained a professional pride in their ability to analyze threats and respond tactically. Montgomery represented a threat they could quantify and prepare for. His operations followed a predictable pattern: massive preliminary bombardments, overwhelming concentration of forces at a single point, methodical advance supported by engineering units clearing obstacles, consolidation of gains before the next push. The German generals could read Montgomery like a textbook because he essentially wrote the textbook on set-piece battles. At Normandy, at the Scheldt, at the Rhine crossings, Montgomery's approach was thorough, professional, and ultimately successful. But it was also slow enough that German commanders could evacuate valuable equipment, reposition forces, and establish new defensive lines. They might lose ground, but they maintained organizational coherence. Patton shattered that coherence. His command philosophy was rooted in an almost fanatical belief in offensive action and speed. He had studied cavalry warfare, the campaigns of Napoleon, and the mobile operations of the Mongol hordes. He understood that in modern mechanized warfare, speed didn't just provide tactical advantage, it induced a form of psychological paralysis in the enemy. When Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy during Operation Cobra in late July 1944, German commanders initially believed it was a limited exploitation. Within days, Patton's armored columns were racing across Brittany, then wheeling east toward the Seine, covering over 200 miles in 2 weeks. German intelligence couldn't keep pace with his movements. By the time commanders received reports of Patton's location, he had already moved 50 miles further. This operational tempo created a cascading psychological effect throughout German defensive structures. Junior officers on the ground would report American armor approaching, only to be told by higher command that such rapid movement was impossible given known logistical constraints. When those reports proved accurate, it eroded trust in the command structure itself. German soldiers began to feel that their leadership couldn't protect them, that the normal rules of warfare had been suspended. Patton's forces seemed omnipresent, striking from unexpected directions, bypassing strong points to attack rear area logistics and command posts, creating chaos that paralyzed German decision-making. The Germans had a specific term for this phenomenon: Patton panic, Patton panic. It wasn't an official military designation, but a colloquial expression that spread through Wehrmacht ranks like a contagion. Units that had fought with discipline and courage against other Allied forces would sometimes collapse when facing Patton's Third Army. Desertion rates spiked. Officers reported difficulty maintaining unit cohesion. The mere rumor that Patton's forces were in the area could trigger premature retreats. This wasn't cowardice. These were the same soldiers who had held positions under Soviet artillery barrages and fought to the last man in countless battles. What Patton induced was something more insidious, a sense of helplessness, a belief that conventional military responses were futile against an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. Eisenhower's conversations with captured German generals revealed specific incidents that illustrated the psychological warfare. During the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, Wehrmacht commanders described a desperate scramble to escape before Patton's forces closed the trap. They spoke not of tactical repositioning, but of visceral panic, of knowing that if Patton completed the encirclement, entire divisions would be annihilated. Some German officers admitted to making decisions not on sound military judgment, but on the desperate need to avoid being caught in Patton's rapidly closing vice. The result was exactly what Patton intended: enemy forces making mistakes, abandoning equipment, fragmenting their command structure in chaotic retreats. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided perhaps the most dramatic example of Patton's psychological impact. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, catching Allied forces off guard and creating a dangerous salient, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of senior commanders. Montgomery cautiously suggested a deliberate response, consolidating forces and counterattacking when properly prepared. Patton, in characteristic fashion, promised to disengage 3 divisions from their current operations, wheel them 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration within 48 hours, a maneuver that conventional military wisdom deemed impossible. He did it in 72 hours. The speed of Patton's response shocked not just the Germans, but his own Allied colleagues. German commanders who had gambled everything on a lightning offensive found themselves fighting a 2-front battle far sooner than their planning had anticipated. The psychological impact was devastating.
The German High Command had designed the Ardennes offensive partly on the assumption that Allied forces, particularly American units, would need weeks to respond to such a strategic surprise. Patton's rapid redeployment demonstrated that their fundamental assumptions about Allied capabilities were wrong, undermining confidence at the highest levels of German command. But Patton's psychological warfare wasn't just about speed, it was about cultivated perception. He understood that reputation amplified effectiveness. He deliberately crafted a public persona of aggressive, almost reckless audacity. His pearl-handled revolvers, his profanity-laced speeches, his controversial statements to the press, all of it contributed to a mythological image that preceded his actual forces. German intelligence officers compiled extensive files on Patton, analyzing not just his tactical methods, but his personality, his statements, his command philosophy. They treated him as a unique threat requiring special consideration, which meant diverting analytical resources and command attention away from other Allied threats. Eisenhower recognized that this psychological dimension represented a form of force multiplication that no amount of additional tanks or artillery could replicate. When a German general admitted during interrogation that his division had retreated from a position that was tactically defensible, simply because intelligence suggested Patton's forces might be approaching, it crystallized something profound. Fear had become as effective as firepower. The question that haunted Eisenhower in those conversations was whether the Allied command structure, including his own decisions, had failed to fully exploit this psychological advantage.
The contrast between Patton and Montgomery wasn't merely a matter of tactical preference. It represented two fundamentally opposed philosophies of warfare, and the tension between them shaped the entire trajectory of the Allied campaign in Western Europe. Montgomery embodied the British military tradition, forged in the trenches of World War I. Never attack without overwhelming superiority, minimize casualties through meticulous preparation, treat war as a chess match where victory goes to the commander who makes fewer mistakes. This doctrine had served Britain well in a war of attrition, but by 1944, the strategic context had changed dramatically. The Allies possessed air superiority, industrial supremacy, and numerical advantage. The question wasn't whether they would win, but how quickly and at what cost. Eisenhower found himself trapped in a political and military quagmire that the German general's testimony brought into sharp focus. Montgomery wasn't just another subordinate commander. He represented British prestige, Churchill's political capital, and the Anglo-American alliance itself. When Montgomery demanded priority in supplies and support for his operations, Eisenhower couldn't simply refuse without risking a coalition crisis. The British had borne the weight of the war for years before American forces arrived in strength. Churchill had championed Montgomery as the savior of British military honor after the defeats of 1940-1942. To sideline Montgomery in favor of the controversial, politically toxic Patton would have been seen as an American power play, potentially fracturing the alliance at a critical moment. Yet the cost of this political calculation was measured in time, territory, and lives. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 represented the apex of Montgomery's influence and the nadir of his strategic judgment. Montgomery convinced Eisenhower to divert massive resources, including elite airborne divisions, air transport, and logistical priority, towards an audacious plan to seize bridges across the Rhine and end the war by Christmas. The operation was vintage Montgomery, ambitious in scope but rigidly planned, with little flexibility for adaptation once launched. When German resistance proved stronger than intelligence predicted, when supply lines stretched beyond sustainability, when weather prevented adequate air support, the entire operation collapsed. Over 17,000 Allied casualties, including nearly 8,000 paratroopers killed or captured at Arnhem, represented the price of Montgomery's methodical inflexibility. During the same period, Patton's Third Army was racing across France with minimal supplies, living off captured fuel depots and ammunition stockpiles, advancing so rapidly that German forces couldn't establish coherent defensive lines. Patton pleaded with Eisenhower for additional fuel and supplies, arguing that with proper support he could punch through the weakening German positions and reach the Rhine weeks ahead of schedule. Eisenhower, constrained by the political necessity of supporting Montgomery's operation, diverted resources away from Patton's advance. The Third Army ground to a halt not because of German resistance, but because of Allied logistics prioritizing Montgomery's failing offensive over Patton's successful exploitation. The German generals who spoke with Eisenhower after the war were intimately familiar with this dynamic because they had exploited it. Wehrmacht intelligence officers had correctly assessed that Montgomery's operations would follow predictable patterns and timelines, allowing them to husband their limited mobile reserves for defensive operations where they could anticipate the main Allied thrusts. But Patton represented an unpredictable variable that terrified German planners. Several captured generals admitted that the pause in Patton's advance during the Market Garden period provided crucial breathing room for German forces to reconstitute defensive positions along the West Wall.
Had Patton maintained his momentum with proper supply support, they believed the war might have ended in 1944 before Germany could mobilize the resources for the Ardennes counteroffensive. This revelation must have been deeply troubling for Eisenhower. He was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. His genius lay in coalition management, political navigation, and strategic coordination across multiple theaters. He had made the decisions that prolonged the war based on reasonable assumptions about alliance politics and operational logistics. But hearing German generals confirm that those decisions had given their forces time to recover challenged Eisenhower's understanding of his own command tenure. The super irony was that by restraining Patton to maintain coalition harmony and support Montgomery's methodical approach, the Allies had inadvertently allowed Germany to prolong a war it had already lost strategically. Montgomery's defenders would argue with some justification that his cautious approach minimized Allied casualties, that his set-piece battles achieved their objectives with acceptable losses, and that Patton's aggressive tactics sometimes exposed his forces to dangerous counterattacks. The disaster at Arnhem, they would claim, was an exception to Montgomery's otherwise successful record. But this argument missed the fundamental point that the German generals were making. In total war against a desperate enemy, psychological dominance matters as much as tactical precision. Patton won battles efficiently. Patton broke the enemy's will to fight. Eisenhower understood this distinction intellectually, but the political realities of coalition warfare had forced him to make choices that prioritized diplomatic considerations over operational effectiveness. The United States couldn't simply impose its preferred strategy on Britain without destroying the alliance. Roosevelt needed Churchill's political support for post-war planning. The American public needed visible cooperation with their British allies. These weren't trivial concerns. They were the sinews that held the Grand Alliance together. But they came at a cost that only became fully apparent in those post-war conversations with captured German commanders. The German testimony also revealed how effectively Wehrmacht intelligence had analyzed Allied command dynamics. They understood the political tensions between American and British leadership. They recognized that Montgomery's operations would receive priority regardless of tactical merit because of Churchill's influence. They identified Patton as the most dangerous Allied commander, but also noted that he was frequently restrained by higher authority. Some German generals admitted to deliberately focusing defensive resources against Patton's sectors, specifically because they knew his aggressiveness would be constrained by supply limitations imposed by Allied command decisions. In essence, the Germans had weaponized the Allies' own coalition politics against them. This realization forced Eisenhower to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of his command. Had he been too accommodating to British sensibilities? Had he allowed political considerations to override military effectiveness? Should he have supported Patton more forcefully, even at the risk of offending Montgomery and the British command? These weren't questions with easy answers. Eisenhower's role required balancing military effectiveness with political necessity, and he had generally succeeded at that impossible task. But the German general's candid assessment suggested that the balance had tilted too far towards caution and coalition management, allowing an already defeated enemy to prolong the conflict and inflict additional casualties. The most damning aspect of the German testimony was how clearly they articulated their relief whenever Patton was restrained. One captured general described receiving intelligence that Patton's Third Army had been halted due to fuel shortages as a gift from God. Another admitted that his entire defensive strategy in late 1944 was based on the assumption that Allied political dynamics would prevent Patton from receiving the supply necessary for a deep exploitation. They had counted on Montgomery's influence to slow the Allied advance, and their calculations had proven correct. The Germans hadn't defeated Patton through superior tactics or defensive prowess. Allied command decisions had done it for them.
What Eisenhower said while he realized German generals feared Patton more than Montgomery has been lost to the careful sanitization of official military history. There are no transcripts of those private moments when the Supreme Commander absorbed the full weight of what these enemy officers were telling him. The official records speak in diplomatic language about tactical assessments and operational debriefs, but the subtext, the unspoken reckoning that must have occurred in Eisenhower's mind, reveals a profound tragedy about the nature of coalition warfare and the invisible costs of political compromise. Eisenhower was not a man given to public displays of regret or second-guessing. His leadership style required projecting confidence, maintaining unity, and accepting responsibility without dwelling on alternative histories. Yet those who knew him well reported a subtle shift in his post-war reflections on command decisions. In private conversations and memoirs written years after the war, Eisenhower would occasionally acknowledge that Patton's operational instincts had often been correct, that the Third Army's aggressive pursuit had achieved results beyond what conventional planning suggested was possible. These weren't dramatic confessions, but quiet admissions that hinted at deeper doubts about the choices forced upon him by political necessity. The German general's testimony crystallized something Eisenhower had probably suspected throughout the campaign, that reputation and psychological impact were force multipliers that couldn't be measured in divisions or tonnage of supplies. Montgomery's methodical operations might look impressive in after-action reports, with neat lines showing systematic advances and acceptable casualty ratios, but they didn't induce the existential dread that Patton created in enemy ranks. German soldiers didn't desert at the rumor of Montgomery approaching. Wehrmacht officers didn't make irrational tactical decisions based on fear of Montgomery's next move. The psychological dimension of warfare, the ability to break enemy morale and induce strategic paralysis, belonged almost exclusively to Patton. This raised uncomfortable questions about the entire Allied command structure and strategy. If one accepts that Patton was the most effective psychological weapon the Allies possessed, then the repeated decisions to restrain him, to divert resources to Montgomery's operations, to prioritize coalition politics over operational effectiveness, represented a fundamental strategic error. Not an error that cost the Allies the war. German defeat was inevitable by 1944 given the overwhelming material superiority arrayed against them, but an error that prolonged the conflict, allowed Germany to inflict additional casualties, and gave the Nazi regime more time to perpetrate atrocities against civilian populations and concentration camp prisoners. Every week the war continued beyond when it might have ended, represented thousands of lives. Soldiers dying in battles that could have been avoided, Holocaust victims perishing in camps that could have been liberated earlier, civilians killed in the final desperate months of German resistance. When viewed through this lens, the decision to support Montgomery's failed market garden offensive with resources that could have fueled Patton's advance takes on a darker moral dimension. Eisenhower had made what he believed was a necessary political choice to maintain alliance cohesion, but the German general's testimony suggested that choice had a body count. The irony that must have haunted Eisenhower was that Patton, the most politically problematic Allied commander, the man who generated constant controversies and required repeated damage control, was also the most militarily effective psychological weapon against Germany. Patton's very qualities that made him difficult to manage, his aggression, his disregard for conventional wisdom, his hunger for glory and advancement, were precisely what made him terrifying to German commanders. He fought not to minimize casualties or achieve neat tactical objectives, but to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to resist. This made him invaluable on the battlefield and nearly impossible to control politically. Eisenhower had spent the entire war managing Patton's excesses while trying to harness his effectiveness. The slapping incidents in Sicily, where Patton struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, had nearly ended his career and required Eisenhower's direct intervention to prevent his removal from command. Patton's inflammatory statements to the press repeatedly created diplomatic incidents that diverted Eisenhower's attention from operational planning to political crisis management. There were legitimate reasons beyond coalition politics for keeping Patton on a tight leash. He was genuinely capable of creating catastrophic political problems if left completely unchecked. But the German testimony revealed that those problems, as serious as they were, paled in comparison to Patton's value as an instrument of psychological warfare. Every controversy Patton generated, every outrageous statement he made, every aggressive action that made Allied politicians nervous, it all contributed to a reputation that German commanders found genuinely terrifying. Patton's image as an unpredictable, aggressive, glory-seeking warrior wasn't a liability in the eyes of the enemy. It was the very thing that made him dangerous. The Allies had tried to manage and moderate Patton's worst impulses, but in doing so, they may have inadvertently diminished the psychological impact that made him uniquely effective. What could Eisenhower say when confronted with this reality? That he had allowed political considerations to override military effectiveness? That coalition unity had been purchased at the cost of prolonging the war? That the most dangerous weapon in the Allied arsenal had been kept partially sheathed because fully deploying it would have offended British sensibilities and created political problems in Washington? These were truths that couldn't be spoken publicly without undermining the narrative of Allied unity and strategic brilliance that the post-war world needed to believe. The German generals who provided this testimony weren't trying to absolve themselves of responsibility for their nation's crimes or their role in Hitler's war machine. Many of them understood that they were complicit in atrocities and would face judgment for their actions. But in the strange candor that sometimes emerges between professional soldiers after a war's conclusion, they were providing Eisenhower with an unvarnished assessment of Allied effectiveness from the enemy's perspective. And that assessment was damning in its clarity. The Allies had possessed a weapon that German forces genuinely feared, and they had consistently failed to fully employ it. In the decades following the war, Eisenhower would go on to serve as President of the United States, where he would again face decisions requiring the balance between military effectiveness and political necessity. Perhaps the lessons learned from those conversations with German generals informed his approach to Cold War strategy, where psychological warfare and reputation management became central components of American power projection.
Perhaps he carried with him a quiet understanding that sometimes the most effective weapons are also the most difficult to control, and that managing allies can be as challenging as defeating enemies. The ultimate tragedy of Eisenhower's realization wasn't that he had made wrong decisions. Given the information available and political constraints he faced, many of his choices were defensible or even optimal. The tragedy was that war itself creates impossible dilemmas, where every choice carries a hidden cost, and sometimes the price of those choices only becomes visible in hindsight. Montgomery versus Patton wasn't really a question of which commander was better in some abstract sense. It was a question of what kind of war the Allies were willing to fight, what risks they were willing to take, and whether psychological dominance mattered as much as methodical precision. The German generals had answered that question definitively. They feared Patton because he fought a different kind of war, one that didn't respect conventional boundaries and couldn't be countered through traditional defensive doctrine. He represented chaos, speed, and aggressive will made manifest. Montgomery represented order, preparation, and controlled violence. The Germans could defend against order. They couldn't defend against chaos. And in that simple truth lay an entire alternative history of how the war might have ended differently, faster, with fewer casualties, with less suffering, if only the Allies had recognized what their enemies already knew, that Patton wasn't just a talented general, he was a weapon of mass psychological destruction that they had never fully unleashed. What Eisenhower said in those moments of private realization may be lost to history, but what he understood, the cost of political caution, the value of psychological warfare, the tragedy of a weapon half used, shaped not just his post-war reflections, but the broader understanding of how coalition warfare forces impossible compromises. The German generals had given him a gift of brutal honesty, and with it, the burden of knowing that victory, however complete, had come at a price that might have been avoided.